paragraphs we are going to take a look at this time around close of the second chapter as we leave the roadside church and be on our way onto the first arc in the city of Passio. And while there are some really well written and exciting parts here to take a look at, we will also encounter some pretty rough spots along the way. Also, we will go on our first extensive tangent to get a clearer picture on the setup that this chapter leaves us with. So let's get on with it. The next day starts with Lawrence going out to wash his face at the church as well, not noticing the absence of Holo it seems, who he then sees walking out of the worship hall with members of the clergy. After a day of miserable rain, dimly lit rooms and scheming and planning, the morning that precedes a day of action, i.e. the departure and the further traveling, is fittingly clear and beautiful. Lawrence, starting his day by washing his face in chilly water, reiterates on that little motif of freshness. Seeing Holo, he acknowledges the comical juxtaposition in her, an undoubtedly pagan goddess, visiting a morning sermon and freely chatting with the clergyman who would not only deny her existence if asked, but who would also burn her at the stakes if her identity would be revealed. Still, he finds himself unable to be amused because of the sheer danger the situation holds. There are two things that came to my mind regarding this event. First, once again we get to see Holo's confidence in her abilities to keep up her masquerade and her knack for mischief, as she is most likely also well aware of the ridiculousness of her presence in a church of all places. Second, there is something about the inherent juxtaposition of this event that makes me believe that it is meant as a joke at the church's expense, not only because Lawrence is almost amused by it. Having in the context of the book, real god visiting a church sermon, thus contrasting the god that exists in the faith of their worshippers, against a physically present, supernatural and self-proclaimed goddess, looks to me like a jab against the idea of faith. Not that I hold any sympathies for the church in this book, especially since it is portrayed so antagonistic to one of our main characters, but if this criticism is intended, it's pretty basic. Nevertheless, it managed to give me a wry smile as I read it this time around. It's just not as clever as I think the book feels it is. And if you may allow me to preempt this, the later books do actually get a lot more mature in their approach to faith. But in the end, it is entirely possible that I'm seeing potshots where there's just a harmless interaction between a masquerading goddess and some clergymen. As Holo splits from the congregation and returns to Lawrence, she imitatively prays for courage for her husband, as to jokingly indulge in and poke fun at the charade they both keep up while residing in the church. Lawrence, pretending to ignore Holo's laughter following her prayer, goes on to pour some of the well water over his head, refusing to participate in the act. In contrast to the more prevalent subtext from the part before, this little interaction is a small example of the strong suits of Hasekura's writing in my opinion. This part barely takes up 3 sentences in the book, but reveals, under closer examination, a lot of character. From Holo's little invitation to act out their masquerade with a saccharine opener, to Lawrence's stern refusal that still leaves no bad taste in anyone's mouth because the whole situation is just some innocent banter on a fresh and promising day that no one is taking too seriously. Holo changes the topic after this to a more melancholic one, as she reminisces about the days she came through the lands on her way to Pasloa, and the church was barely established. All the while, she completely rejects the church mythology as crude jokes, just like she did all those years ago, as she self-reassuringly declares that nature isn't something created. But is this something she actually knows? From what we have seen so far, her godhood is rather ordinary. While she does possess supernatural powers, shapeshifting and reteleportation, words I'd never thought I'd ever have to arrange this way, Holo isn't framed as a creator god or a world-spanning force like the Abrahamic idea of a capital G god. So it is open to interpretation if her remarks are a pure statement of fact from an authority figure, possibly a little nudge to the presumed atheistic reader, just like the little jab a few sentences prior, or if she is maybe struggling with her own worldview, being reintroduced to a world that has, in her absence, submitted to ideas she deemed ridiculous. I honestly can't tell with certainty. Holo's relation to her self-identified godhood is surely something worth examining as we go along. Her speech reminds Lawrence of the criticism a natural philosopher would levy against the church, while being even more amusing to him as it is a who knows how old harvest god talking. The fact that he finds it amusing at all in a world of zealots also further cements Lawrence's relation to religion, as the first chapter already made him out as someone who doesn't take organized religion to heart. And the next sentences also bring out his proclivity for superstitions again. He leaves some copper coins in the tithe box, as it is expected of guests that use the well. Lawrence does this primarily so the clergy doesn't say unlucky things about him, as he needs all the luck he could get. But, true to character, the coins he leaves there are borderline worthless. Money still takes precedence to superstitions, it seems. Holo, still trying to grasp how much the world has changed while she was stuck in Pasloa, speaks up. Although the lack of any descriptions of the way she speaks and the content of her speech in mind, it comes across like she is speaking mostly to herself.
I suppose this is a sign of the times, then. Much has changed. Presumably she referred to her homeland, given the desolate expression on her face. Have you yourself changed? Asked Lawrence. Holo shook her head wordlessly. It was somehow a very childish gesture. Then I'm sure your homeland hasn't changed either.
Fittingly, the following paragraphs right before the departure from the church, and thus the departure from the introduction onto the first story arc, delivers basically a small summary of the main motifs and themes that came before. We start off with Holo's current position and goal, being long gone from home and wanting to return whilst she is unsure of her homeland's condition. The need for reassurance of Holo's unchanged nature reinforces the isolation she had to stoically endure whilst in Slow. Even though she negates, the question to what degree the years of seclusion have taken their toll on her remains. And given her outbursts of anger and desperation back in chapter 1, while she was explaining her relation to the village to Lawrence, there are some hints at some injuries that go deeper than what we've seen until now. Also, this sets up possible conflict as Holo is now being introduced to a world she more or less doesn't know, or rather, a world she doesn't know anymore. I can't help but notice that Lawrence basically lies again, as he is aware that, as far as he knows, Yoitsu has been destroyed long ago. But as this is again on the same topic as his previous lie, we might infer that Holo is incapable of discerning the truth when she is worried or distracted. Or maybe she knows but doesn't want to accept that Lawrence is withholding something? Regardless of the lie, this also pinpoints a striking flaw in Lawrence's current relation to Holo. He's trying to help her, yes, but as far as we can see, he is almost completely incapable of actually engaging with the various sources of Holo's problems. He is neither capable of fathoming the scale of time on which Holo interacts with the world, nor could he wish Yoitsu back into existence if he'd want to. Though, as he is well accustomed to loneliness, as he himself has seen much of the world and wasn't at home since he was a boy, he understands the nostalgia. This gives him the confidence to at least offer a shoulder to cry on, so to speak. Relatability is an important aspect here. Lawrence provides a past of loneliness on a human scale that, I suppose, most readers can probably, at least partially relate to. Since it is to some degree analogous to Holo's past, it simultaneously helps relating to her, while also reminding the reader that they, just like Lawrence, can only guess at the actual scale of the isolation Holo had to endure. Going back to the fact that he is withholding the story of the destruction of her homeland to give comfort, underlines his actual powerlessness and leaves the door wide open to interpret his behavior or untruthfulness towards Holo as malicious. I personally believe in Lawrence's sincerity in wanting to help, given his thoughts and behavior up to this point, even whilst keeping the less charming character traits in mind. But nonetheless, his current course of action is flawed, to say the least. Also, explaining the current relation between the protagonists in detail kind of makes it sound like there's already an effort there to enter a committed relationship, but that is for now definitely not the case. That's just something that came to my mind rereading the text that I would like to clear up if necessary.
Holo nodded, her face emerging slightly from underneath the cloak. "'Twould be a disgrace to the name Wise Wolf to be comforted by you, though," she said with a smile, turning and heading back toward their room. She gave him a sidelong glance that could have been interpreted as gratitude. As long as her attitude was that of a very sly, very old person, Lawrence could cope. It was her childish side that he found difficult. Lawrence was 25. If he lived in a town, he'd be married and taking his wife and children to church. His life was half over, and Holo's childish demeanor penetrated his lonely heart.
Holo acknowledges Lawrence's commiseration, but still chooses to play up her haughtiness. And even though it is played as a joke, or just as a bit of banter here, the conflict between Holo's Wise Wolf persona, the stoic and dutiful goddess, and her hedonistic, more human side is central to her character. Furthermore, we get Lawrence's position in life outlined again, with the admission that Holo's presence, and especially her playful attitude, makes him realize just how much he missed company. Noticeably, Lawrence does not weave Holo directly into his thoughts of a regular town life. Though I could only guess if that's out of respect, if he doesn't see Holo in that way, or if it's a subtle display of a remaining slither of fear.
"Hey, what keeps you? Hurry!" shouted Holo, looking over her shoulder at him. It had been a mere 2 days since Lawrence met Holo, but it felt like much longer.
And lastly, we get this final bit of the paragraph that drips with wanderlust and excitement, especially since Lawrence empathizes the perceived length of the last days in stark contrast to his previous 7 years that have, up to this point, mostly been described as one more or less frantic bone-grinding chase for money. At least until recently, when his worries and doubt about his personal future started to set in. This little send-off before the next scene that already starts outside the church also heightens this atmosphere of departure by the placement of the two characters. Holo already being in front of Lawrence, looking back at him, asking him to hurry up, where he, dumbfounded by the perspective of this new and exciting chapter of his life, is literally held back by the past, even if it's just for a moment. While this would probably be a good spot to end the chapter, we still have a bit to go through. Nevertheless, I believe this is also a good time to go on a bit of a tangent, because there are some things I would like to discuss better sooner than later. Also, the tangent is neither long enough to warrant an extra part, and we are, I believe, at the best point in the story for it, since it mostly engages with the basic setup of our protagonists. Before we can get there, though, we need to establish some basics that probably should have been already covered. So, I want to clarify how I interpret the narration, i.e. all the parts of the text that aren't direct dialogue. I'd say it is pretty clear by this point that Spice and Wolf is written with a third-person limited narrator. So, while at first glance the narration seems to view the situations from an outside perspective, as it uses third-person personal pronouns, the knowledge and feelings the text reflects are limited to one person, Kraft Lawrence. We get his inner feelings described directly, while we have to guess at those of all the other characters by their actions, or Lawrence's interpretations of those actions for that matter. Furthermore, parts of the book that are purely concerned with establishing locations are seemingly bound to the knowledge Lawrence possesses. Going back to part 1 of the second chapter, when we approached the roadside church, the text covered that the church survives on tithe, unlike the monastery from chapter 1, that the church opposes all other ideas of supernatural beings, and what people one can expect to meet when staying a night there. Any detailed explanations of the hierarchy of the clergymen or the history of this specific church is missing, because it is most likely something Lawrence has no information about. So when the book states something like,
"This centuries-old harvest god was talking like a natural philosopher criticizing the church, which made it all the more amusing,"
I'll interpret this as Lawrence's thoughts in this specific moment. It is not an outside narrator judging if Holo's dismissal of creation theory is funny, but Lawrence, which also, as previously examined, reveals something about Lawrence's character and worldviews. Having established this, I can get to the point that matters to me, and that is the question if the current promise of Spice and Wolf, or more precisely the setup of our protagonist, falls into the narrative trope called Born Sexy Yesterday. So, to preface this, not all criteria I'm presenting are going to map onto the story, but I should establish the trope thoroughly before we can see what applies and what doesn't. This is not an attack on the story, but a pop cultural lens that might help us to see where Spice and Wolf goes above and beyond media conventions and where it maybe doesn't. I want to take a look at this because I personally learned to resent this trope over the years, and I think that, at first glance, Spice and Wolf does share some similarities with it. The term, Born Sexy Yesterday, was coined by YouTube essayist and pop culture detective Jonathan McIntosh and describes a common relationship setup in speculative fiction with a lopsided teacher-student power dynamic in the day-to-day life between a wise, experienced man and a naive woman. As I said, there are already problems mapping this aspect neatly on Spice and Wolf, but hear me out please. To be born yesterday is an idiom to describe someone as extremely naive, inexperienced, and/or ignorant. This is a defining character aspect of the woman in this pairing. She is, in essence, the mind of a naive but highly skilled child in the body of a more mature woman, who most often excels in combat or another usually male-dominated field. Often she is an outsider, like an alien, an android, or some magical being. This is the usual justification for her being inexperienced with worldly things, especially sex, romance, or basic social interaction. McIntosh uses a movie quote,
"Profoundly naive, unimaginably wise,"
to identify the essence of this characterization. From this, there's a high chance that there's at least one scene where the Born Sexy Yesterday strips nude in front of men, because she is completely unaware of her own sexual appeal, and she is the protagonist's love interest. The male counterpart is defined by the following traits. He is straight, red-blooded, alone or unsatisfied in love, disenfranchised or directionless, and can't or doesn't want to find a woman from his own world. His unremarkableness is his defining feature that only gets validated or even elevated in contrast with the naive female counterpart to whom he can explain the world to. This setup automatically makes the ordinary man the greatest man in the eyes of the born sexy yesterday, because he is, by the nature of this setup, the only man in her life. So, to what degree does Spice and Wolf fit this trope? Holo does certainly fit the idea of an outsider to the ordinary world of the setting in two ways. Firstly, she is a magical being, in this case a harvest goddess / shapeshifting giant wolf, and hails from a remote region that is to our knowledge more mystical than the mostly populated rest of the land. Secondly, after she traveled the human world, she spent hundreds of years isolated again in a small village that started to ignore her more and more. So for now, Holo is neither up to date on historical affairs, the technologies or customs of the world. Furthermore, she does tend to behave childish. To bring up the quote from earlier,
His life was half over, and Holo's childish demeanor penetrated his lonely heart.
we already established that an essential part of Holo's character is the conflict between her stern, godly side, unimaginably wise, and her cheerful and yearning persona, profoundly naive. And the text even plays directly into this dichotomy.
The face underneath the cloak was that of a girl barely in her mid-teens, which showed occasional glimpses of someone much younger. Yet her words had the air of someone much older.
But I think it is especially this point where problems in applying this framework start to show up. But let's get to more similarities first. I wouldn't want to claim that determining lies, a major skill of Holo, is a typically gendered field of expertise, but since we know of her true form as a roughly horse-sized wolf, it is reasonable to say that she is also a physically powerful being. And then there are the scenes where she strips nude or is already naked in company of the male protagonist, unfazed of his presence. Furthermore, Lawrence is, as far as we know, a pretty ordinary, straight and healthy man who is, or rather was, alone, since his profession made it impossible for him to find a partner. But here we can start to wrap around to all the things that Spice and Wolf does that accomplish more than the trope encompasses, or where it even just differs. Arguably, Lawrence is but a mere mortal, but he's not just someone. His profession in this case is necessary for Holo's escape to work. And more importantly, I believe that Lawrence, as a character, is no surrogate average Joe for the reader to completely project themselves onto, but, for what we know, an already very defined character that the reader has to engage with as well. Also, the bullet point of the male hero being directionless or disenfranchised stands in contrast with Lawrence's driven attitude to achieve his goals. He might be disenfranchised to some degree because his work excludes him from a regular social and societal life, but I do not think that this is pivotal in this regard. And going back to Holo, there is a crucial point that makes the trope inapplicable, from which most other points follow. Holo is not ignorant nor inexperienced, especially in social interactions. Her split between unimaginably wise and profoundly naive does not work that easily, because her lighthearted side is not childish, but all in all still pretty mature. I mean, it was her more hedonistic side that let her break with her sense of duty, her wise wolf side, to start out on an adventure to get hold of her own destiny and visit her home again, which is certainly not the way a surrogate child would act. Sure, she plays up her childishness, but she is a self-determined character. Mostly. I mean, she was bound to Lawrence's cargo for roughly a day, but luckily this possibly toxic part of their tie-up has already been overcome. Furthermore, Holo's complexity of character renders the basic premise of the lopsided power dynamic moot as well. While she is indeed somewhat foreign to the current world, she is also not helplessly at Lawrence's mercy to guide her through it. From what we have seen up until this point, they seem to be at least on par in their capability to navigate their way through trouble, like pretending to be a married couple to smuggle Holo into a church together. And as we have seen in the very scene we started from this time, she is also very much able to keep up her masquerade without Lawrence around. And the teacher-student dynamic has flipped between our protagonists a lot already. And to cover the last characteristic of the trope, while it is arguably a bit convenient to titillate the reader that Holo's animalistic side partially manifests itself in her being naked twice already, she is definitely not unaware of her sex appeal. To bring up a quote already brought up in part 1 again,
I haven't taken human form in some time. Charming, no?
And then there is a whole scene where they dry off in the rented room, where Holo is very much teasing Lawrence. And the text makes it clear on several occasions, like the whole paragraph in chapter 1 describing Holo's body in explicit detail, that Lawrence does find her very much attractive. And yes, this makes the insistence of the books to describe her as looking mid-teen even more off-putting. Look, this is probably as uncomfortable for me as it is for you, but to finish this off, I have to recognize that the children in a woman's body aspect is inverted here to woman in a teenager's body. And both are problematic if you ask me. Whew. So, what's the verdict? I think I can say with justifiable certainty that Spice and Wolf does not fall into the born sexy yesterday trope. While it does share some superficial elements, the core, the character dynamic between the protagonists, is more varied, complex, and overall very equal in contrast to the expected static teacher-student relation. Furthermore, neither protagonist fit their respective mold, especially Holo. And since this is only the beginning of the series, I'd say it's reasonable to expect the characters to get more developed and thus even further away from the trope. Nonetheless, I thought it to be important to examine this dimension, if not only for the reason that this question bugged me for quite a while now, and I finally have a pretty definitive answer. Well, back to the story. Outside the church, Lawrence and Zarin agree to meet in the riverside town of Paseo to sign a formal contract for their business and part ways, as the younger merchant, who is on foot, can take a quicker road due to the recent rain. As he leaves, it is explained that usually young merchants starting out carry well-preserved goods to sell in churches and taverns as conversation starters, as it's their first priority to learn about different regions and their people, as well as to leave an impression there. Seeing Zarin on this step in his career makes Lawrence nostalgic for his time before he acquired his wagon. After some distance is put between them and the younger merchant, and checking if no one else is around, Holo begins grooming her tail. The priority of her tail's fur to her hair seems to irritate Lawrence to some degree.
Possibly because she had to cover her ears with a cloak, she did not bother combing her fall of chestnut hair, merely tying it back with a length of hempen rope. Lawrence felt that she could at least comb it, but he had no comb to offer. He resolved to acquire a comb and hat when they arrived in Paseo.
Besides the typo in the last sentence that is present in the printed book, as well as the Kindle version by the way, Lawrence's way of thinking is on full display here. Since it doesn't seem to bother him too much, he doesn't speak up, but thinks directly of solutions, noticeably without actually asking Holo. But he also doesn't think of those items as presents to flatter her with, substantiating his mostly pragmatic thought process. I think that this might also be a bit of an echo to a part discussed in the first video on this chapter. Namely, that Lawrence cares about his looks only to the degree that it is good for business. This seems to be the standard he also holds other people to, or at least his companions. Is it too much to think that him being seemingly irritated by Holo's uncombed hair makes him out to be a bit vain after all? As Holo remarks that merchants seem to be always on about time, as Lawrence points out that Zarin will be quicker on foot than they are with the wagon, he responds with the aphorism "time is money," which in turn sparks a little but noteworthy discussion between the two. Noteworthy because this discussion is frankly one of the worst parts in the whole book if you ask me.
I imagine the farmers you watched over for many centuries were mindful of time. As soon as Lawrence said it, he realized he probably shouldn't have. Holo glanced at him as if to say, "I'll let you have that one," smiling impishly. At what have you been looking? The farmers care nary a whit for time. It's the air they're mindful of. I don't follow you. They wake in the dawn air, work the farm in the morning air, pull the weeds in the afternoon air, twist rope in the rainy air. They worry over their crops in the windy air, watch them grow in the summer air. They celebrate the harvest in the autumn air, and in the winter air, they wait for spring. They think not of time. Like me, they note only the air.
I mean, I guess it's an ungrateful task to channel the wisdom of the idea of a century-old goddess into words, but this is just... I mean, if only there was a concept that would help us identify the sequence from dawn to afternoon, or any other air of the day. Okay, if I would want to pour out my goodwill and concede that Holo's feelings toward the linear progression of events is different, her being a possibly immortal being and all that, I'm still convinced that a medieval farmer was very concerned about time. From expected growing periods of crops to the time left till dusk. And even if I'm totally wrong with that, it's just very easy to poke holes into the idea itself. This whole "I don't think in terms of time, but in terms of air" bit just feels a bit pretentious. Anyway, seeing Lawrence stunned by her lecture, Holo relishes her victory in this little argument for a short while before praising him for being quick-witted, though lacking in experience, to which he jokingly suggests that maybe she herself got old and slow when he can keep up with her. This whole exchange, even with the parts of dubious quality, does a good job at communicating the competitive aspect of and the sportsmanship in the banter of our protagonists. In this regard, it is tonally most related to the chat as they had just arrived at the rented room, even though that one was more tense due to the intimate and flirty atmosphere. Still, since most conversations up to this point carried some serious undertones, or even some mysteries about the characters, this dialogue strengthened the light-hearted feeling of the current scene. I bring this up now because exactly this is about to change. From Lawrence's little insult, Holo takes things too far and starts to tease him with stories of wolves wanting to eat humans in an effort to become, presumably, smarter themselves. Missing the cues that this topic is especially unpleasant for Lawrence, as he has witnessed the brutal demise of fellow merchants in wolf attacks, she continues to push the question if he ever got attacked, to which he eventually snaps back angrily and tells her to stop.
Still, have you ever been attacked by wolves in the mountains? I have. Perhaps 8 times. They're quite difficult to handle, are they not? They are. Wild dogs I can handle, but wolves are a problem. That's because they want to eat lots of humans to get their— I'm sorry, alright? So stop. The 3rd time Lawrence had been set upon by wolves. He was part of a caravan. 2 of the men in the caravan had been unable to clear the mountains. Their cries echoed in Lawrence's ears even now. His face was expressionless. Oh, apparently the perceptive wise wolf had figured it out. I'm sorry, said a contrite Holo, slumping, almost shrinking.
This marks the first time we see Holo backing up on teasing Lawrence, and I think, as a way to round out her character, it's good to see that her self-satisfied demeanor knows boundaries. We have witnessed Holo's vulnerable side already in Chapter 1 mostly, but since Lawrence agreed to take her with him, she held onto her mask of confidence. So a reminder of the humility underneath the smugness was a good inclusion at this point, I believe. The ensuing awkward silence is then broken as Holo reluctantly asks if Lawrence is angry, to which he finds himself outsmarted in a way, as this direct way of asking makes him unable to actually communicate that he really was angry. Though, his answer to this question is still a resounding yes, but probably not with a delivery as stern as he had wished for. Seeing the sulking Holo soothes Lawrence's mood again to some degree, so he speaks up to move the exchange past this point of conflict.
I am angry. No more jokes like that. He finally turned to her and said. Holo nodded resolutely and looked ahead. She now seemed quite meek.
This further underlines the honesty of her apology and thus reinforces the reminder of Holo's soft side. But nonetheless, for Holo, the topic is not quite through yet. After a small pause, she picks up the conversation again to excuse, or rather explain, the hostile behavior of wolves. Lawrence seems actually a bit annoyed at this, as he at least thinks about ignoring her, but chooses not to make later conversations less difficult. Holo goes on explaining that wolves, as they do not live with humans like dogs, know them only as enemies, and thus respond with violence themselves. The seriousness in Holo's explanation brings Lawrence back into the conversation. I want to refrain from poking holes in the explanation of the relation between wolves and humans here, wolves being actually predators and some such, because I think the context of the fantasy of having a spokesperson for the wolves here makes the whole species more human-like in their intelligence, and thus makes the violence begets violence theme reasonable in this case. I am willing to suspend my disbelief for this. The vagueness, or rather the implications of her knowing all this, leads Lawrence to ask if she had ever attacked humans. But Holo stops him mid-question, explaining that there are things she simply cannot answer. Lawrence, angry at his own thoughtlessness, apologizes for asking a question about such uncomfortable and possibly regretted actions, to which Holo smilingly acknowledges that they are now even.
A 25-year-old was not, it seemed, a match for a wise wolf.
This struck me as a bit odd. With the competitiveness resurfacing again, after an exchange that flared up Lawrence's traumas, it seems like Holo baited Lawrence to overstep some boundaries so they break even at the end, which would be a no doubt crafty, but still a pretty petty move. But since the very next sentence reassures us that the bad air between the two has faded, this might indicate just this in a different way. I'd rather have Holo honestly apologizing and then trying to explain herself than her baiting Lawrence to make up for her own transgressions. And while I also don't think that this is the implication the text wanted to elicit, I could get how someone would arrive at this conclusion. With that, the day and the chapter winds down. And while it would probably be better to discuss the last paragraphs after bringing them up, I would want to show them uninterrupted as an outro here, to better convey their feelings as the ending of the chapter. Just like the departure from the church, this part communicates wanderlust in a very effective way to me. There is no more bad air, just the open road and the good weather. And while there is a short-term destination, the actual endpoint of their journey is completely out of reach, yet somewhere out there. Also, the mention of possible dangers and risks of the journey only heightened the excitement. And it ends with the last word from Holo, as they both lie in the mountain first in the wagon's bed again, telling Lawrence that for now, her and his world are very different. And it doesn't feel condescending, but to me implies all the possible things they both can learn from each other. Maybe you know what I mean.
There was no further conversation, but neither was there any bad air between the two. The horse plodded along, and soon the day had passed and night fell. A merchant never continued his travels after dark, when it had rained. If the wagon became stuck in the mud, 7 times out of 10 it means that the goods would have to be abandoned. To turn a steady profit as a traveling merchant, one had to minimize losses, and the road was full of dangers. Holo suddenly spoke, nestled in the fur pile beneath the sky she'd promised would be clear the next day. "The worlds we live in, you and I, are very different," she said.